Picture this. It's 1836, and Josiah Wilbarger is having what you might generously call the worst day of his life. He's lying face down in the scorching Texas dirt, 3 Comanche arrows sticking out of his body like some kind of macabre pincushion. And here's the kicker: he's been scalped. Now, when I say scalped, I don't mean he got a bad haircut. I mean the top of his skull is exposed to the brutal Texas sun, and he should be dead. By every measure of human endurance, by every medical understanding of his time or hours, Josiah Wilbarger should have become buzzard food that August afternoon. But here's where this story gets interesting, because sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor. As Wilbarger lay there, probably thinking about his wife, his kids, maybe wondering if this was how his story ended, he noticed something above him. Crows. Not just 1 or 2, but an entire murder of them, and they were doing something specific, something his Cherokee grandmother had taught him about when he was just a boy sitting by her fire, listening to stories that white settlers usually dismissed as superstition. Those crows were flying in a pattern, spiraling clockwise, diving and rising, then flying straight and calling exactly 7 times. And suddenly, through the haze of pain and approaching death, Wilbarger remembered what that meant. When crows fly straight and call 7 times, death has passed you by. Now, you have to understand something about the American frontier in 1836. This wasn't some Disney movie where everything worked out because the good guys had better hearts. This was a place where nature tried to kill you every single day, where 3 different cultures, Native American, Mexican, and Anglo, were locked in a struggle that would reshape a continent. It was a laboratory of survival where the wrong decision didn't just mean failure, it meant your bones bleaching in the sun. And yet somehow, from this cauldron of violence and hardship, emerged something remarkable. Knowledge, techniques, secrets, if you will, that could keep a human being alive when everything else said they should die. Wilbarger began to crawl. 11 miles. Think about that for a moment. 11 miles, with a scalped head, 3 arrows in his body, under the Texas sun that could cook a man even when he was healthy. But he wasn't just crawling randomly. He was following what his grandmother had taught him about reading the land, about twisting prairie grass into rope to bind his wounds, about using buffalo tallow animal fat to seal injuries and prevent infection. 3 days later, Wilbarger crawled up to his own cabin door, alive. His wife opened that door expecting to find her husband's body, and instead found a living, breathing testament to knowledge that most people thought was just old wives' tales. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. Wilbarger wasn't unique. He wasn't some superhuman, frontier superman. He was just a man who knew things that thousands of other people knew, scattered across the frontier in Native American tribes, Mexican settlements, and Anglo communities. 7 specific techniques, to be precise, that could mean the difference between seeing another sunrise and becoming another unmarked grave on the prairie. Before the first wagon wheel ever carved ruts in prairie soil, before the Mexican-American War redrew the map, before the California gold rush sent hundreds of thousands west, these techniques already existed. Comanche warriors had perfected water divining, using willow wands and prayer, not because they were mystical, but because it worked. Apache hunters consumed prairie fire ash mixed with prickly pear juice for strength during 7-day pursuits, not because of some spiritual ritual, but because it gave their bodies essential minerals that prevented the kind of physical breakdown that killed other men. Mexican vaqueros had discovered how to render javelina fat into a miracle fuel that burned even in torrential rain. Think about that. A fuel source that worked when everything else failed, when matches were soaked, when firewood was drenched, when hypothermia was creeping in to claim another victim. These weren't random folk remedies or lucky accidents. They were survival technologies, refined over generations, tested by life and death, and passed down through families and communities that understood something fundamental. Knowledge was the ultimate wealth on the frontier. And then something beautiful happened, something that gives you hope about human nature, even in the midst of cultural conflict and territorial warfare. These techniques began to cross cultural lines. At Bent's Fort in 1842, and if you don't know about Bent's Fort, you should. because it was like the grand central station of the frontier. A profound exchange took place. Yellow Wolf of the Cheyenne, a man who could read the sky like we read a newspaper, made a trade with Patrick O'Sullivan, an Irish immigrant who probably still had potato dirt under his fingernails. Yellow Wolf traded the complete knowledge of crow reading everything his people knew about predicting weather, finding water, detecting danger, by watching these black-winged prophets for a single steel knife. One knife. Can you imagine? Yellow Wolf had no way of knowing that he was about to save 10,000 future lives. O'Sullivan had no idea that he was receiving knowledge worth more than all the gold in California. But that's exactly what happened, and we know this because O'Sullivan kept a journal that wasn't discovered until 1998, hidden in the walls of a house in Colorado, giving us a window into this lost world where survival knowledge transcended race, nationality, and religion. By 1850, something remarkable had emerged from this cultural mixing. 7 techniques, fully formed, tested by thousands of people across hundreds of thousands of square miles. 7 secrets that could keep you alive when the world was trying its best to kill you. Water divining with willow wands that could detect underground streams up to 40 feet deep. Consuming prairie fire ash for essential minerals that prevented the madness of alkali poisoning because, yes, there was a specific kind of insanity that came from drinking the wrong water, and these techniques prevented it. Using fermented horse urine mixed with gunpowder to neutralize rattlesnake venom, and before you wrinkle your nose, remember that modern antivenin costs thousands of dollars and might not be available when you need it most. Reading crow behavior to predict weather, find water, and detect danger with accuracy that would make modern meteorologists jealous. Rendering animal fat into waterproof fuel that burned at 2,000 degrees hot enough to melt copper, reliable enough to save your life in a blizzard. Building tumbleweed shelters sealed with saliva and mud that maintained 70-degree temperatures when it was 30 below outside. And using gunpowder mixed with whiskey and honey as an antibacterial that prevented gangrene better than anything doctors had in their black bags. Maria Gonzalez lived to be 103 years old. She was a curandera, a healer, and in 1920, when reporters asked her about the old ways, she told them something that should give us all pause. She said these 7 secrets were worth more than all the gold in California, because they bought what gold never could, another sunrise. But here's the thing that should make you lean forward in your chair, because this story isn't really about the past. It's about us. It's about what we've forgotten, what we've lost, and what that forgetting has cost us. Because by 1900, railroad timetables and factory whistles were drowning out the crow calls that once guided a nation. Thomas Edison's electric light made men forget how to read tomorrow in the evening sky. And that forgetting, that systematic abandonment of knowledge that had kept humans alive for generations, would cost 20,000 preventable deaths over the next 50 years. But the story doesn't end there, because sometimes, just when you think wisdom is lost forever, it resurfaces in the most unexpected ways. And that's where our story really begins to get interesting, because in August 2019, an investment banker named Marcus Chen was about to rediscover what Josiah Wilbarger knew in 1836, that sometimes the old ways are the only ways that work. Charles Goodnight was staring at disaster. It was 1866. The worst drought in living memory had turned the staked plains into a furnace, and every known water source for 200 miles had dried to cracked mud. 500 cattle were dying, their tongues swollen black, their eyes rolling white with heat madness. 18 men looked to Goodnight with the kind of desperation that comes when you realize you might die within sight of home. But Charles Goodnight wasn't panicking. He was remembering. 3 years earlier, at a trading post in New Mexico, a Comanche woman, whose name history didn't bother to record, had shown him something. She'd taken a forked branch from a willow tree, held it in her hands with a grip that looked casual but wasn't, and walked in slow circles until that branch suddenly plunged downward like it was being pulled by invisible hands. "Water," she'd said. "Always water, where the stick points down." Goodnight had thought it was interesting, maybe even useful someday. He hadn't thought it would save his life. Now, with the sun beating down like a hammer and his cattle dropping one by one, Goodnight reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a willow wand he'd been carrying for 3 years without ever using it. His foreman, Jake Potter, later testified under oath about what happened next. Because what happened next made Charles Goodnight one of the richest men in Texas. Goodnight walked in expanding circles for 6 hours. 6 hours under the blazing sun, while dying cattle bellowed and desperate men watched, probably thinking their boss had finally cracked under the pressure. The forked willow branch trembled in his hands like a living thing, responding to something the men couldn't see or understand. And then it happened. The branch suddenly plunged downward with such violent force that it nearly pulled Goodnight to his knees. Right there, in ground that looked no different from the bone-dry earth stretching in every direction, the willow wand said, "Dig here." 20 feet down, they hit an underground river that saved 500 head of cattle, 18 human lives, and established what would become the J.A. Ranch Empire. This single act of water divining, witnessed by dozens of men and recorded in multiple journals, generated over $2 million in profit and proved something that the business schools of his day would never have taught, that mastery of the 7 techniques meant mastery of the frontier itself. But Goodnight wasn't unique. During the great cattle drives from 1865 to 1885, when hundreds of thousands of longhorns moved north from Texas to Kansas railheads, these survival arts reached their golden age. Cowboys faced death daily from stampedes, lightning, blizzards, Indians, outlaws, disease, and simple accidents that could leave a man broken and helpless 100 miles from the nearest settlement. In that environment, knowledge wasn't just power, it was currency, and some men became masters of that currency. Tom Sullivan earned the nickname Prairie Ghost for his ability to appear and disappear across the vast grasslands, like he was part of the wind itself. But Sullivan's real talent wasn't vanishing, it was reading the sky. Specifically, reading the black-winged messengers that most cowboys saw as just another annoyance of trail life. Sullivan became the greatest crow reader in history. He could predict blizzards 72 hours in advance, locate water sources from crow behavior alone, and detect approaching Indian war parties when the birds were still specks on the horizon. Trail bosses paid him triple wages, more than they paid their top hands, more than they paid their cooks, more than they paid anyone except themselves. Because Sullivan's knowledge could save an entire herd and the lives of everyone driving it. His apprentice was a freed slave named Moses Washington, a man who understood that knowledge was the one thing that couldn't be taken away from him. Washington documented Sullivan's methods in coded journals that reveal astonishing accuracy. When crows flew in figure-8 patterns, water lay within 2 miles. When they dove rapidly and then rose straight up, predators, human or animal, were approaching within 1 hour's travel. When crows fell completely silent after sunset, killing frost would arrive by dawn. The precision is breathtaking. These weren't vague superstitions or lucky guesses. These were scientific observations refined over decades of life and death testing. In 1878, Sullivan made perhaps the most famous find in frontier history. Following crow patterns in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona, he located what became known as the Lost Dutchman's Mine, a gold deposit worth millions. But here's what tells you everything about the man's character. He left it untouched. When asked why, Sullivan reportedly said that gold meant nothing to a man who could read tomorrow in black wings. The economics of survival knowledge created an entirely new frontier hierarchy. Mexican vaqueros who had perfected fat-rendering techniques commanded higher wages than college-educated trail bosses from back east. Women like Rattlesnake Annie Morrison built medical empires on horse urine antivenom that saved over 300 documented lives, charging $50 per treatment, more than most cowboys made in 2 months. A cowboy's worth wasn't measured by how fast he could draw his gun or how well he could rope a steer. It was measured by how many of the 7 techniques he'd mastered. Could he find water when the streams ran dry? Could he predict weather when the sky looked clear? Could he build shelter when winter came early? Could he treat snakebite when the nearest doctor was 300 miles away? The winter of 1886 to 1887 became the ultimate test. It was the winter that killed the open range, the winter that ended the great cattle drives, The winter that old-timers still talked about 50 years later in hushed voices. 90% of open-range cattle died. Entire ranching empires collapsed overnight. Men who had been cattle kings in November were bankrupt by spring. But here's the thing that should make you pay attention. Ranches whose cowboys knew tumbleweed shelter construction lost only 10% of their herds. Let me repeat that, because it's important. While modern operators who had abandoned traditional methods faced complete ruin, the cowboys who still practiced the old ways, who could build shelters from tumbleweeds and seal them with mud and spit, who knew how to render animal fat into fuel that burned hot enough to keep men and cattle alive, they survived. It was a lesson written in frozen cattle and bankruptcy papers. Progress without wisdom equaled death. During the Tascosa Siege of 1881, a group of cowboys found themselves surrounded by hostile forces, cut off from supplies, facing starvation in a standoff that stretched on for days. They should have died. They should have surrendered or been picked off one by one as hunger weakened their resistance. Instead, they survived 7 days without food by consuming prairie fire ash, tea, a technique that gave their bodies essential minerals and kept them stronger than their well-fed attackers. When they finally emerged from that siege, walking out under their own power while their enemies watched in amazement, the story spread through every cow camp from Texas to Montana. These weren't just survival stories anymore. They were legends, gospel, proof that the 7 techniques weren't just useful, they were miraculous. But even as these techniques reached their peak of development and application, even as they were saving lives and building fortunes across the frontier, the world was changing. Railroad lines were pushing west, bringing with them a new kind of thinking, a modern kind of thinking that said the old ways were backward, primitive, embarrassing. By 1900, something terrible was happening. The last generation that knew these techniques was aging out, dying off, taking their knowledge with them. And the new generation, educated, progressive, modern, was too proud to listen. They were about to learn a lesson that would cost thousands of lives, that forgetting the past isn't progress. Sometimes, it's suicide. But before we get to that tragedy, before we explore how America systematically abandoned knowledge that could have saved countless lives, we need to understand just how complete that abandonment would be, and how much it would cost us when the bills finally came due. By 1900, something heartbreaking was happening across America. Railroad timetables were drowning out the crow calls that had once guided a nation. Thomas Edison's electric lights made men forget how to read tomorrow in the evening sky. Factory whistles marked time instead of the ancient rhythms of weather and season that had kept humans alive for generations. And that forgetting, that systematic abandonment of knowledge that had sustained life on the frontier, was about to cost 20,000 preventable deaths over the clays. Next 50 years. Picture Sarah McKenna in 1903. They called her Desert Rose, and she had earned that name by surviving 40 years in some of the harshest country on earth. She had seen the 7 techniques save hundreds of lives. She had watched her own children grow up knowing how to find water with willow wands, how to read the weather in crowflight, how to build shelters that could withstand prairie blizzards. But Sarah McKenna was also a woman who could read the signs of more than just weather. She could see what was coming. A world that would call her knowledge superstition, that would label her techniques as primitive embarrassments, unfit for modern times. So she spent her fortune, every dollar she had saved from 40 years of desert survival, publishing 5,000 copies of The 7 Sacred Arts of Survival. 5,000 books containing everything she knew, everything her teachers had known, everything that generations of frontier survivors had learned through trial and error and blood. Progressive educators burned them as primitive superstition, unfit for the modern age. Think about that for a moment. In 1903, at the height of American confidence in progress and technology, educators, people whose job was supposed to be preserving and passing on knowledge, were literally burning books that contained survival techniques that could save lives. When Sarah McKenna died in 1912, her son found her still clutching a willow wand. Water was pooling beneath her deathbed from an underground spring she had divined but never tapped. She had died knowing where water was, but unable to convince anyone that the knowledge mattered. It was a perfect metaphor for an entire generation's rejected wisdom. But the systematic suppression of frontier knowledge wasn't just cultural snobbery. It served specific economic interests. Patent medicine companies couldn't sell expensive snakebite cures if people knew that horse urine worked better and cost nothing. Water drilling companies lost profits when farmers could divine their own wells with a forked stick. Construction firms faced competition from men who could build warm, weatherproof shelters from tumbleweeds and mud. In 1908, the Cattlemen's Association officially banned discussion of traditional techniques at their meetings, calling them embarrassing relics of a barbarous past. But here's the hypocrisy that should make your blood boil. Those same cattlemen were secretly hiring old-timers when drought threatened their herds. They publicly condemned the techniques as superstition, while privately depending on them for survival. This double standard reached tragic peaks during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. 300,000 people fled lands that indigenous techniques could have made survivable. Government agricultural expert Hugh Hammond Bennett privately admitted in 1936 that prairie fire ash consumption would have prevented most deaths from dust pneumonia, the lung disease that killed thousands during the dust storms. But Bennett was afraid of being ridiculed for promoting what progressive society had labeled Indian superstition. So, he stayed silent, and people died. The human cost of forgetting manifested in tragedy after preventable tragedy. The Galveston hurricane of 1900 killed 8,000 people. 8,000. But here's what should haunt us. Every traditional practitioner who still knew how to read crow warnings survived. Every single one. The crows had been telling them for days that a killer storm was coming, but the modern, educated, progressive residents of Galveston didn't speak that language anymore. During the 1918 flu pandemic that killed 50 million people worldwide, thousands died who didn't know that gunpowder medicine could prevent the secondary infections that actually killed most flu victims. The knowledge existed. It was sitting in the memories of old cowboys and frontier women, proven effective over decades of use. But nobody thought to ask them, because asking would have meant admitting that the old ways might be better than modern medicine. The Great Depression saw families starve beside water sources their grandfathers could have found blindfolded. Maria Santiago, interviewed by oral historians in 1975 when she was 91 years old, told a story that should make us all ashamed. In 1934, she watched her neighbor's children die of thirst while she quietly divined water for her own family. She was afraid to reveal her knowledge because she feared being labeled a witch. A witch. In 1934 America, a woman was afraid to save children's lives because society might call her a witch for knowing how to find water. The last verified master of all 7 techniques was a man named William Thompson. They called him Dust Devil because he seemed to move with the wind, always one step ahead of trouble, always finding what he needed to survive. Thompson had learned from Comanche elders, Mexican curanderas, and Anglo cowboys. He was a living library of frontier knowledge. He died alone in 1953 in a Phoenix nursing home. Alone, forgotten, dismissed as a relic of a primitive past. His final words, according to the nurse who attended him, were, "The crows are flying backwards, storm coming from tomorrow." Even at the end, he was reading signs that nobody else could see. But here's what should terrify us about this systematic forgetting. It wasn't just cultural evolution or natural progress. It was willful ignorance. It was the conscious decision to abandon knowledge that worked because it didn't fit our image of ourselves as modern, scientific, progressive people. We traded wisdom for pride. We traded survival for sophistication. And we paid for that trade with thousands of lives. The techniques didn't stop working when we stopped believing in them. Water was still there to be found. Weather patterns still existed to be read. Natural medicines still cured what they had always cured. We just stopped listening to the people who knew how to access that knowledge. By 1950, the 7 techniques had been almost completely forgotten. Almost. Because in a few scattered places, in the memories of very old people who had learned to keep their knowledge secret, the techniques survived. Waiting. Waiting for a time when pride would give way to necessity, when sophistication would bow to survival. when modern Americans would finally be ready to admit that their great-grandparents might have known something worth remembering. That time was coming sooner than anyone imagined. And it would arrive in the most modern way possible, broadcast live on the internet for 5 million people to see. Because sometimes the old ways don't just survive, they rise again. More powerful than ever, when the new ways finally fail us. August 2019. Marcus Chen had it all figured out. Investment banker turned survival instructor, he was leading 12 high-powered executives into the Mojave Desert for a weekend of what he called executive wilderness training. These weren't just any executives. These were people who controlled billions of dollars, who made decisions that affected thousands of employees, who lived their lives insulated from anything resembling actual danger. Chen's company specialized in giving these corporate titans a taste of controlled adventure. They paid $10,000 each for weekends that included GPS systems, satellite phones, emergency beacons, freeze-dried gourmet meals, and guides who made sure nothing actually dangerous ever happened. It was wilderness training for people who had never been more than 20 feet from a cell tower. But the universe has a sense of humor, and sometimes that humor is darker than we'd like. On August 15, 2019, the sun burped. A massive solar storm, the kind that happens maybe once a decade, sent electromagnetic pulses racing across space at millions of miles per hour. When those pulses hit Earth's atmosphere, they created one of the most beautiful aurora displays in recorded history. They also fried every piece of electronic equipment within a 1,000-mile radius. Suddenly, Marcus Chen and 12 executives were standing in 115-degree heat with $10,000 worth of useless technology. No GPS, no satellite phones, no emergency beacons, no way to call for help, no way to navigate, no way to even tell anyone where they were. The executives began to panic. These were people accustomed to solving problems by throwing money at them, by delegating to subordinates, by leveraging resources they controlled. But money doesn't buy water in the desert. Delegation doesn't work when there's nobody to delegate to. And the only resource that mattered, knowledge of how to survive, was something none of them possessed. Except Marcus Chen was remembering his grandmother. His grandmother had been born in China in 1920, had lived through wars and famines and disasters that would have broken most people. She had told him stories that he'd dismissed as old country superstition, tales about reading signs in nature, about finding what you needed when everything else failed. One story in particular came back to him as he watched 12 successful, powerful people slowly realize they might die in the desert. His grandmother had told him about crows, about how they could lead you to water if you knew how to read their behavior. Chen looked up. There were crows circling overhead, and they were flying in a specific pattern that triggered a memory buried so deep he wasn't even sure it was real. But with 12 people depending on him, and the sun climbing toward its killing peak, Chen decided to trust a story his grandmother had told him 50 years earlier. He followed the crows. For 3 hours, through terrain that looked identical in every direction, he followed their evening flight pattern until they led him to a seasonal water source that saved 13 lives. One of the executives live-streamed the entire experience on his phone, one of the few devices that survived the electromagnetic storm because it had been shielded in a metal case. That video, showing a modern investment banker saving lives using ancient knowledge, went viral in ways that social media had never seen before. 5 million views in the first week, 20 million by the end of the month. And something extraordinary happened in the comments section. People started sharing their own stories. An elderly rancher in Montana talked about his grandfather's water divining techniques. A former army medic described using traditional wound treatments in Afghanistan. A grandmother in New Mexico shared her family's recipes for natural medicines that worked better than anything from the pharmacy. Marcus Chen had accidentally launched what historians now call the Great Remembering. Within 6 months, Chen's Ancient Wisdom Survival School had 12,000 enrolled students, desperately seeking to reclaim techniques their great-grandparents had considered common sense. But this wasn't just nostalgic hobby learning. This was serious people with serious money, investing serious time in knowledge that could save their lives when their technology failed them. And as they learned these techniques, something amazing happened. Modern science began to validate every single one of them. MIT researchers published a study in 2021 confirming that willow wands actually do detect electromagnetic fields generated by underground water movement. The forked branch isn't magic, it's responding to measurable physical phenomena that sensitive equipment can also detect. The technique works because underground water creates electrical fields that affect the electromagnetic properties of certain woods. Stanford chemists proved that prairie fire ash contains bioavailable minerals in precisely the ratios needed to prevent neurological damage from dehydration. What frontier survivors called desert madness was actually a specific form of mineral deficiency that killed thousands of pioneers. Prairie fire ash prevented it more effectively than any modern supplement because the minerals had been processed by natural fire in exactly the right way. Johns Hopkins validated that specific enzymes in horse urine neutralize rattlesnake venom proteins more effectively than modern antivenin. Not only does it work, but it works faster and with fewer side effects than the treatments that cost thousands of dollars and might not be available when you need them most. Cornell ornithologists spent 3 years documenting crow behavior patterns and confirmed that these birds predict weather changes with 92% accuracy. They're living barometers, responding to atmospheric pressure changes, electromagnetic fields, and other environmental factors that human technology is only beginning to understand. Military researchers at Fort Bragg demonstrated that rendered animal fat creates a hotter, more water-resistant fuel than any commercial alternative. It burns at temperatures hot enough to melt copper, stays lit in conditions that extinguish other flames, and can be produced anywhere animals exist. Arctic survival experts confirmed that tumbleweed shelters sealed with mud and saliva maintain internal temperatures better than modern emergency blankets. The natural materials create insulation systems that adapt to changing conditions in ways that synthetic materials cannot match. And perhaps most remarkably, battlefield medics in Afghanistan reported that gunpowder-honey mixtures prevented infection better than standard antibiotics in field conditions. When supply lines were cut and medical equipment was destroyed, old frontier medicine saved lives that modern medicine couldn't reach. Every single technique has been validated by modern science. Every one. But the real story isn't just scientific validation. It's about who's learning these techniques and why. The new masters of these rediscovered arts represent America's most unlikely alliance. Tech millionaires learning from elderly Mexican ranchers, urban preppers studying with Native American elders, military special forces training with the grandchildren of cowboys who still remember. Amanda Williams is a black software engineer from Oakland who makes 6 figures writing code for social media companies. But 3 years ago, she discovered her great-great-grandmother's slave narrative, hidden in a family Bible. That narrative contained detailed descriptions of water divining techniques that enslaved people had used to find wells on plantations. Williams taught herself those techniques and became such a skilled water diviner that she now teaches sold-out classes to Silicon Valley executives who pay $2,000 to learn what enslaved people knew for free. She's found water for tech campuses, residential developments, and agricultural projects across California. Jake Martinez is a former Army Ranger whose unit survived an Afghanistan ambush using gunpowder, medicine, and fat-rendering techniques he'd learned from a 100-year-old survival manual found in his grandfather's. Martinez realized that primitive techniques often outperformed million-dollar military equipment, so he started training NATO forces in what the military now calls traditional survival skills. The movement has grown from curiosity to necessity as Americans confront a harsh reality. Our technology is fragile, our supply chains are vulnerable, and our environment is becoming increasingly unpredictable. Climate change, economic uncertainty, and technological dependence have reminded us that our ancestors' knowledge offers insurance that no money can buy. Today, there are 700 certified schools teaching the 7 techniques to over 1 million students annually. From boardrooms to military bases, from suburban prep groups to university research centers, Americans are rediscovering that some wisdom becomes more valuable with age. The great irony is that techniques once dismissed as primitive superstition are now cutting-edge survival technology. What progressive educators burned as embarrassing relics are now taught at Harvard Business School as adaptive leadership skills. What modern medicine once scorned as folk remedies are now studied by pharmaceutical companies searching for new treatments. The 7 sacred techniques of frontier survival have risen from the ashes of forgotten knowledge to become the foundation of a new understanding. That forgetting the past might be the one mistake we can no longer afford. Because in a world where technology can fail, supply chains can break, and climate can change overnight, the knowledge that kept our ancestors alive for thousands of years might be exactly what we need to survive whatever comes next. The crows are still flying. The water is still flowing underground. The old ways are still working. We just finally started listening again. And that might be the most important lesson of all. That survival isn't about having the latest technology or the most money or the best equipment. Survival is about knowing things, real things, true things, things that work when everything else fails. Things that a scalped man named Josiah Wilbarger knew in 1836, crawling 11 miles under the Texas sun because crows had told him death had passed him by. Some knowledge never dies. It just waits for us to remember that we need it. And sometimes, that remembering arrives just in time.